Hi, my name is Carmera Thomas, and I will be the moderator today. Welcome to Resilient Coastal Forests of Virginia. I am also a planner with the Chesapeake Watershed Forum, but I want to get started with a few housekeeping. The session will be recorded and posted to Sked within the next 2 days, so you can watch that later. All attendees will be muted unless you're speaking. Please use the chat feature if you have any questions throughout the session. I will monitor the chat for questions. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a message and we'll try to work that out with you. We encourage you to rename yourself. So there are 3 little dots on the side of your name that you can put your name and then your pronouns and your organization that you're with. Lastly, the rest of the forum can be found on sked.com. I will copy and paste the link in the chat box. And now I'll turn it over to Karen and Matt.
Thank you very much, Carmera. We're looking forward to speaking with you all today. And I'm under strict orders by Matt to finish my part on time so that he can tell us the most interesting parts, which are the management implications for our work. So I'll begin just by taking us through an overview of the project and why we're doing this work, and then Matt will take on from me halfway through, and we have a couple of polling questions to keep you all alert on this rainy day. So next, please. Okay, and I think everyone knows this recording will be shared. Yes, this is me, Karen Firehock. Click on. And Matt Lee, our community landscape forester. He'll be presenting, as I said, second. Next. So we'd like to start off with a poll just to get a sense of who is in the audience. So we created a little poll, and please just click on the one that best represents you, or if you are not listed in this list, then click other. We'll give you a minute or 2 to do that. Okay. Hopefully everyone's had a time to figure out who they are this morning. We'll close that poll. All right, so we've got quite a few nonprofit folks in the audience. We are also a nonprofit, so hail to the nonprofits. Students, great to see students, university staff, and of course some local folks, local government, state government, and federal. So a pretty nice spread there. Let me just see if anyone, I'm not sure if anyone put other. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so as I said, we are a nonprofit. The Green Infrastructure Center helps communities evaluate green assets and manage them for ecological, economic, and cultural returns. So we're interested in the ecology of communities. We're interested in how they have healthy economies and the cultural values of having a healthy environment and economy. And then we build landscape models. So we're going to talk about some of our modeling today. We also do a lot of teaching, courses, and workshops, and then research into new methods. Next. And we've written a number of books and guides. So obviously we will not be covering everything we could ever say today. So if you're interested in learning more, we have a free guidebook for Virginia on evaluating conserving green infrastructure across the landscape. In the middle, that book there is Strategic Green Infrastructure Planning, and it takes a national approach, and it includes a lot of urban examples and is applicable anywhere. And then finally on the right, Green Infrastructure Map and Plan the Natural World with GIS. So if you are adept at using geographic information systems, that book is for you, and it ties to a national model of the entire country that we built. So there's a lot of free tools and free case studies on our website that you can download at gicinc.org. Next, please. Okay, so all of our work is done with partners. As I said, we are a nonprofit, and so we write grant proposals and form alliances with different organizations to do the work that we do. And in the project we're going to talk about today, Resilient Coastal Forests, we have partnered with the U.S. Forest Service and the Virginia Department of Forestry. Next, please. So we have 3 pilot studies. So the project we'll be talking about today is Virginia's work, but we are doing this work across 3 coastal states. So we're also going to be comparing and analyzing the results of forests. And it's very interesting to have this spread across 3 states because we also are going to be seeing migration of some of both the tree species as well as some of the pests and problems heading north as the climate warms. But we are looking at the multiple and interacting threats that are happening to southern forests, which we'll talk about today. We're working to create an actionable plan. So we're not simply going to be doing models and maps, but actually the purpose of this project is to determine what should we do? What are the things we can do to adapt as the climate is changing and also as other threats are continuing to expand, such as development, which has always been a challenge. We're working in partnerships with the state forestry agencies in all 3 states, which are Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. And very importantly, we're using local knowledge to drive key decisions. So we're not simply relying on state and national data. We're also collecting field information, and we're working with our local advisory committees in each of those places because we want to really bring in what people know and their observations about what's happening to forests. And also they'll be the people implementing any ideas or actions. And then, as I said, the project is funded by the states and the U.S. Forest Service. Next, please. Okay, so our study area for Virginia, just to zoom in, is really along the both shores of the York River watershed, really the lower York before it flows into the bay. And if you look at the kind of jaggedy lines of the boundaries here, that is because that is the watershed boundary. And we're specifically trying to pick up a diversity of different types of communities. So we have very rural communities like Matthews, and then we have other communities like around Williamsburg that's developing rapidly. So we want to bring in and tie in all of the different kinds of threats, whether they're urban, suburban, or rural. Next, please. And there are a lot of different types of threats. I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with most of these. Development, of course. So with or without a changing climate, people would still be growing their communities and a lot of people developing into rural areas. We also have threats, of course, from storms. That we've always had hurricanes. There's always been hurricanes, but we're concerned with increasing frequency and intensity. But that this has an impact for our forests from die-off, from salt harm, as well as just inundation and behavior. So just the things that we do. So one of the greatest causes of wildfires is actually people. Next. So in your first question, I've tainted you a little bit with my opinions, but in your opinion, which threat is the biggest or most widespread? And you have several options there: sea level rise, storm surge, etc. And then the second question is, which is the most damaging? So it might be something that's causing more harm. So go ahead and take the poll and we'll see what you guys think. Give you a minute to think about it. That was a harder question than who you are. Okay, so that's the end of instant knowledge. Let's see if we can get to the results. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to click at least 2 circles. Hope I'm not rushing anyone. Okay, so in terms of which is the biggest threat, the thing that's causing the most change, development is the biggest, okay, according to you guys. Not so much for fire, so that's interesting you guys said that. We'll see what we have. Invasive species, of course, and that's also tied to development, right? The more we encroach into areas, we bring a lot of invasive species with us. Pests and disease, fragmentation, the breaking up a forest into smaller and smaller pieces. And then let's see if you can scroll down for me so I can see which is the most severe or damaging. I can do that. Okay. All right. Which is the most severe or damaging? So storm surge and flooding got the most votes there. Sea level rise maybe less, but partly maybe because it's happening over a longer time frame. And then development, okay, because permanent conversion, it's not a temporary threat. Once you develop. Fire, and a few more points there, and then fragmentation. All right, so we'll close that poll. All right, go on to the next slide. All right, and there are a lot of different reports and opinions out there. We have collected hundreds of journal articles that we've read, and we're actually doing a literature review as part of this project, but just pulled out a few choice quotes. So from EPA, what climate change means for Virginia, we can see that tropical storms and hurricanes have become more intense during the past 20 years, although warming oceans provide these storms with more potential energy. Scientists are not sure whether recent intensification reflects a long-term trend, but hurricane wind speeds, rainfall rates are likely to increase as the climate continues to warm. And it's really interesting today, we're sitting here under some threats of flooding here in Virginia, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Gulf is warming. It's warmed at least 4 degrees, and that creates more water that's pulled up into these storms through evaporation. And then these Gulf storms are coming and dumping water in Virginia. So even hurricanes far away from us are having an impact. Next. Next, thank you. All right, and this is just some examples of what some of these impacts that we see on the ground. These are impacts from storm surge and flooding, and I took these pictures in Norfolk, Virginia. But if you look up at the left top picture, that tree has been killed by too much inundation happening with great frequency, salt, or both. And then at the left here, we see this tree, and what's happening here is high tides have become so much higher that now this person's front yard is suffering from high tides. And you see what's happening to this tree. It's getting undermined, and that tree will not survive. And then up here on the top right, you also just see this kind of open area, but this area used to be filled with trees. And so this kind of constant inundation has caused these problems. Next. Okay. And then some additional quotes from EPA. So sea level rising more rapidly along Virginia's shores than in most coastal areas because the land is also sinking. And so we have this sort of double problem. We have not only is the sea rising, but the land is subsiding. So the sort of Hampton Roads area of Virginia is the second most threatened landscape in the country. The first most threatened is the landscape down around New Orleans and Louisiana, but we are the second most threatened. And some of that sinking is due to large amounts of water withdrawals that have happened in the past. So our aquifers have shrank. Okay, next. And then I know that right now the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually working on their 5th national report, but in the last, the 6th national report, but the last one that they produced looked at the fact that storms, floods, and erosions have always been hazards, but when we have rising sea levels, we're now seeing a threat to approximately $1 trillion in national wealth that's held in coastal real estate. The chats are getting in the way of my presentation, sorry. We will have comments at the end, and we will respond to all of your questions at the end. It's fine to put them in the chat room now as you're thinking of them. So we're really concerned with not only the harm to our environment, but also the economic harm that we will suffer. Next. And one of the, I know of a lot of you guys picked urbanization and development as the biggest threat, and you're right. It's the single biggest factor in the loss of forest land acreage. So since 2001, over 484,000 acres of forested land has been lost to just changing land use, converting. So 64% of that land was cleared for urban development and 30% for agriculture. The thing about agriculture is that is a continuing environmental and economic use of the land. Urban development is a permanent change that is difficult to undo. Next. And then, of course, another quote from our friends at EPA, 70 years from now, temperatures are likely to rise above 95 degrees, approximately 20 to 40 days per year in the southeastern half of Virginia, compared to about 10 days per year today. And there's actually some additional reports that have come out recently on urban heating and predicting even more severe impacts. So we're also having problems from saltwater creep, which allows a thick thatch of Phragmites or greenbrier to invade forests and other land cover. And this quote is from Robbie Lewis, who's Virginia's coastal forester and our partner on the project. And one of the things he really pointed out to us was that what happens is this is occurring near housing, so that becomes a safety concern. And then Phragmites, which we are all probably familiar with Phragmites as an invasive plant. But what happens is that when you get a thick thatch of that, they become a ladder fuel to the upper canopy. So a fire that might have been a ground fire now can jump up to the top of the canopy through the Phragmites. So it is a real concern that invasives can actually increase fire risk. Next. And then the southern pine beetle. Again, we've had problems with the southern pine beetle for many years. It's not necessarily a new threat. But as I said, we're doing this project in multiple states. And if we look down in our other project in South Carolina, one of the things they've been seeing is that it's becoming so warm there that they're starting to not have that cool period that they relied on over the winter to tamp down those pine beetles. And so now they're having pine beetle outbreaks earlier, as early as February. And these warming trends will then also potentially result in more reproductive cycles per year, so more pine beetles. And then what happens is drought-stressed trees are more susceptible to being infested. So yes, we've always had the pine beetle, but as one of the things we see with climate change is you not only have more wet periods, but you also have more long extended drought periods. So it causes more extreme fluctuations in the weather. And so as a result, we have the possibility for more reproduction of pests. And there are many pests that this applies to, but I did not want to give you dozens of slides on pests. So just to highlight that one. And a lot of pests are also kind of on the march northward as the climate warms. Our northern states are becoming more hospitable to pests that we really considered as southern pests. Next. So we're looking at the forest through many lenses. And so, like I said, we're looking at the ecology, and there is a picture on the left of the shores of the York River. And they've always had these sandy coastal cliffs that are eroding, but they seem to be getting hit more frequently, having more erosion. We're looking at the economics, and the economics are not just loss of coastal real estate, but potential threats to our forestry industry. And then also culture, the things that we enjoy about accessing the water, fishing, all of those things that we do on the water can also be at risk. Next. So the dominant natural, vegetation of the southern coastal plain region is what we're looking at, and that is indeed forests. And fresh and salt water sort of intermixing actually causes us to have a really high biodiversity. And of course, we all know that Chesapeake Bay is the nation's most productive estuary. But there are also extensive tracts of industrial forestry in our study area. And we're in close proximity to ports, which can be another vector for invasives to come in, but also lots of active fishing, recreation, vacation destinations. And that's also causing a lot of our rural communities to start to grow. We've also noticed that with COVID, some of the sort of more sleepy rural communities are starting to see almost population explosions because people are coming there. When we were doing some of our field work, people asked if we were there to buy real estate. Which I've not been asked that question before. And then we want to just emphasize that threats that we're looking at are both from nature and people. Next. All right, and then forests provide many benefits, and since I'm preaching to the choir, if you will, I don't need to go through all of these, but of course, biodiversity and wildlife habitat is key. Working landscapes that help us maintain our rural economies. Water quality and supply. Of course, forests help with groundwater recharge and also help protect our open reservoirs. Cost-effective stormwater management and hazard mitigation. So we've done a whole study on the role of trees in stormwater. If you want to find out more, you can go to our website. And then we're interested in public health, quality of life and recreation networks. So our ability to get out and enjoy the landscape. Next. Trees do a lot of things positive for us. They clean the air, they absorb pollutants, bulk organic compounds, they cool counties and cities, well-being and mental health. People heal faster when they can see or access green. Less crime actually occurs near trees. So I work a lot with police officers and talk to them about how trees actually make your community safer. People exercise more around trees, and they shop longer and pay more, about 12% more in tree-lined retail areas. And there indeed is Robbie Lewis, the forester, inspired by the trees, going to get some ice cream. But companies who relocate place a strong importance on the green of the local environment. And then trees buffer against storms, which is really important. A lot of our buffers need to be thickened. Next. All right, and stream buffers play a huge role in helping to filter runoff, not just from overland flow, but actually through the roots and through the soil. And as I said, help to recharge the groundwater. And a 100-foot buffer removes more than 90% of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment from overland runoff. Next. All right, and about 20% of annual rainfall or more is retained in the crown of trees, even in urban areas. Trees help to delay runoff, so that helps that water soak into the ground and break down in contaminants. Soil capacity has actually improved the infiltration capacity, even in urban areas where roots help break up those the soil and provide channels for water to flow. And then one large tree soaks up thousands of gallons of runoff. So we've been successful convincing some homeowners not to cut down that big tree in their yard because it'll help them with urban flooding. Next. And then what we're really concerned with, we talked about forest fragmentation in our list, so I'm going to go into a little more detail. It really just means breaking up the forest into smaller and smaller parcels, or chunks of forest rather. And here we have an example of a forest core, and that is a sort of term of art, not that we invented it. But what it means is that we have at least 100 acres of intact forest. And that's important because to support native songbirds of the Chesapeake region, we need at least 100 acres of intact interior forest for those interior forest dependent species. So we use satellite imagery to analyze the landscape and see whether we can come up with enough acreage. That's at least 100 acres. And then we want to make sure that we're not including as part of that calculation the edge, because the edge is where a lot of impacts happen. And the edge is calculated by taking the average height of a tree and we multiply times 3. So 67 feet is the average tree height around here. But we, just to give us a little extra, fudge factor, we'll just say 100 and multiply times 3, and that's 300 feet. So we subtract that 300 feet and ask, do we still have 100 acres of intact forest in the middle? And then as you can see, when we put a road through a forest core, we've now created so much edge that we no longer have a core remaining. Next. Okay, so we also are concerned with corridors that connect these cores so that wildlife and plants and pollinators and even people can move across the landscape. An ideal width is about 300 meters so that we have at least 100 meters of safe space in the middle for species to migrate. Next. And so here's how we do this work. This is showing an aerial image. We get this information from several different sources, but the US government flies the country every couple of years. And so there's a rich data set. I know there's also additional data that's available from efforts on all the Bay States that have made to capture new high resolution land cover. But we are analyzing it ourselves to make sure that we can capture every single tree possible. So next. So we use the infrared reflection of the different types of vegetation and also LiDAR to look at height so that we don't mistakenly think that a bush is a tree. And we come up with these sort of neon green colors. Those are the trees in the area. Next. And then we can add in those features that we know are splitting up that landscape and causing that edge effect. So we've added in the urban environment, buildings and roads. Next. And then we can say, is any of that, using calculation tools in GIS, is any of that 100 acres? And so indeed, yes, this dark red color in the middle was big enough to be at least 100 acres, and that is now a habitat core according to our analysis. And then you see there's a little fragment in that red outline just to the north, and that is still in a forest, is still providing water quality benefits, but it's not quite large enough to be a core. Next. Okay, and then we also expand with our model to also include habitat cores that might also be wetlands. So a habitat core really means intact contiguous habitat. And so we're also capturing some of these marsh wetlands here on the right. Next. Okay, and so Matt's going to now take us through some of the benefits that these forests are providing. And if you look here now at this map, you see in dark green, we have the forest cores. And the light green are all the other woodlands that are at least 10 acres or more. So go ahead, Matt, take it away.
Thank you so much, Karen. So now that we have a method for showing the distribution of existing forest cores and woodlands across the landscape, we can start inventorying some of those and quantifying some of the ecosystem service benefits that these forests are providing within the study area. Next slide, please. So protecting and preserving water quality and supply, we analyzed the streams within the study area, and 761 miles of those streams are forested. With a 100-foot buffer around those streams, 89% had forest cover. With a 600-foot buffer, 75% of that area was forested, so pretty good in terms of forest cover for some of the streams within the study area in terms of their water quality benefits. The 37,000 acres of wooded wetlands and 31,000 acres of non-forested wetlands were within the study area, and that's providing a lot of benefits for stormwater management and hazard mitigation for flood storage, so really providing some of those water quantity benefits. And then in total, there's 337,000 acres of forest cover, and that's contributing a lot to public health, quality of life, recreation networks, and the local economy with some of the forest sector industry that's in the study area. Next slide. Using that forest cover acreage, we were able to calculate the air quality benefits across the study area using the US Forest Service iTree multipliers for these specific air pollutants. So you can see that there's quite a significant amount of air pollution that's removed from the atmosphere and captured or sequestered, improving health quality benefits for the communities that make up the or located within the study area. 32 million tons of carbon are stored within those forests. So the communities that are looking at this as from a climate action standpoint, the forests are really providing, and we're able to qualify those benefits, qualify and quantify those benefits to the community and the public when we're engaging them around why these forests are so important and why they should be protected and conserved. Next slide, please. We also zoned in at a higher resolution and looked at what is the urban tree canopy for the urban communities within the study area. And we've also calculated the air quality benefits for these particular towns and cities. I'm just not going to show you that data in this presentation today, but we've also done those calculations. And so you can see now each of the communities has an urban tree canopy map and the percentages of what the urban tree canopy makes up of those communities. We can look at that data and those maps and help them look at what is the distribution of the canopy within their towns. Are there certain neighborhoods that are lacking canopy? Are there certain issues around flooding or heat where potential areas could be planted to increase the urban tree canopy and provide those services and benefits to the residents? So looking at things both from the rural and the urban perspective and coming up with some strategies. And this is much higher resolution data, so we can really zoom in and be able to make some more strategic decisions at the neighborhood level. Next slide, please. So when we talk about resilience, what are we actually talking about? And we are using a textbook definition of resiliency that has 3 characteristics. So one is the amount of change the system can undergo and still retain the same controls on structure and function, the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization, and the ability to increase and build capacity for learning and adaptation. And the first one's really important when we start talking about risk in these next slides, that we want to see not only what is the risk to a forest from a particular threat, but what are those risks compounded for multiple threats? And then also not all risks are as severe. So for example, Karen mentioned urban development permanently converts the land from a forested state to a non-forested state. So there's no amount of really adapting or changing that system to get it back to its original forested state. Whereas something like fire that comes across the landscape, yes, it can completely destroy a forest, but a forest will regenerate back from that state, ideally, unless other threats come in and kind of reduce its resiliency. Next slide, please. So we mapped the spatial extent of various threats and determined what factors increase risk to forests from the rural to the urban. And then we also evaluated how threats interact with one another in southern coastal forests. Next slide, please. So this is the list of the coastal threats to coastal forests that we looked at. So the things that you responded to in the poll: fire, sea level rise, storm surge, urban development, pest, disease, and invasive species; isolation, which is the distance, a significant distance from one forest core to another; permanence, so how much disturbance of the forested landscape there is across the study area; and then also a corridor analysis, or how well connected are the forest cores to each other. So are there a lot of different pathways that wildlife could use to be able to move across the landscape? Next slide, please. So for our threats analysis, we evaluated using one or more data sets, either national, state, or local, to determine level of risk or the likelihood a particular threat would occur. And then we classified those risks into high, moderate, or low. And then each threat was given a weight, and all threats were summed for every forest core to give a composite score. So really trying to see how did those different threats and those risks of threats compound with each other to give us an overall risk. Next slide, please. So here you can see the extent of sea level rise. We used 3 feet rise in sea level out to 2060, which was the extent of the time horizon we looked at for this study. We used the Army Corps of Engineers sea level rise curve calculator, which is based on NOAA's 2017 data. And this was a moderate curve projection, so there were much higher extremes for sea level rise that were predicted out to 2060, as well as some lower ones. But we decided to go with the middle of the route, the middle of the road, to predict out what sea level rise could potentially do to this area. So compared to other study areas, for example, the South Carolina and Georgia, sea level rise was actually a much more widespread risk or threat to coastal forests. And part of that for the Virginia area had to do with the Virginia bolide, which is an impact crater that's located off the coast in the Chesapeake near Matthews County. And that created those kind of sea cliffs that Karen mentioned earlier and had some pictures of. So a lot of those were protecting some of the coastline from sea level rise encroachment in terms of being able to access some of those more interior coastal forests. Go ahead and click on, you can see here that there's no real forest cores within the study area that are going to be impacted by sea level rise, but some of those forest fragments and some of those forest woodlands were going to be impacted. Next slide, please. This is some storm surge data from NOAA. We used category 2 hurricane. We used the category 2 hurricane storm surge because it tends to be a more common type of storm event that occurs compared to category 4, for example, in its frequency. And so we broke that out into low, moderate, and high. Go ahead and click on the next one. And so here you can see how that storm surge is going to impact those coastal forests. So as Karen mentioned earlier, the salt spray and the inundation from coastal flooding were the serious concerns going on with the coastal forests here. And as you can see, there's a few spots where the risks are pretty high to moderate, but for the most part, there's some really significant forest cores that are pretty well protected from storm surge. Next slide, please. Urban development was a big one that we looked at, and again was tended to be one of the more higher or more widespread risks. One of the models that we used was called Sleuth. This is an urban growth model that predicts growth patterns out to 2060. So the high in the red is really high risk, where low tends to be yellow. And you can see that a lot of the areas are spreading out from a central core of urban development and expanding out into the rural areas of the landscape. Next slide. But that growth model did not look at all of the factors that we wanted to consider as risk. So one of these is urban context, and this is looking at parcel size. So smaller parcels are more likely to be developed than larger ones. So in this case, small parcels were classified as less than 2 acres, and large parcels were classified as greater than 10, and then in between 2 and 10 was considered moderate. So this was another data layer that was pulled in to kind of capture the ability to be able to develop parcels within the study area. Next slide. We also know from the literature that the distance to major roads is a big predictor of urban growth. So opportunity and access for commuters, or to be able to access urban services like hospitals or grocery stores, influences a lot where development occurs and where people decide to live. So we looked at the distance away from major road systems. Next slide. We also researched the zoning for the entire study area for all the different counties as well as the cities, and pulled out what zoning was allowed for more urban types of development or growth, and then classified those as high risk, and the more rural types of zoning were classified as lower risk. Next slide, please. And then we come up with a total score for development risk. Now, one of the things that we also did was we pulled in protected lands, whether they were federal, state, military, local lands, or conservation easements. And we recoded those places as having low risk for development because they had some kind of legal status protecting them from higher intensity development. Next slide. And just looking at that across the forest woodlands and forest cores, you can see the red are where there's the greatest risk for development, and the green, the lowest risk. There's some actually really large green in Matthews and Gloucester counties that are really well protected or have low risk for urban development. Next slide. Fire was another one that we looked at. We used probability of ignition and severity as our 2 main factors when looking at the risk of fire. So for ignition, we use the sleuth model. As Karen mentioned earlier, most wildfires are started by human sources, whether either intentionally through arson or through human infrastructure like a down power line or a spark, cigarette being thrown out from a car. So that was a predicted layer that we used for determining ignition. We also did a quarter mile to development, existing development, and then mean return fire interval, which is how frequent that fire returned on the landscape historically, based on its land cover type. And then next slide. We also looked at severity, which we classified as above ground biomass. So the more fuels that are present on the landscape, the hotter and the more intense the fire can be, potentially causing a more catastrophic fire. Next slide. And so here you can see the risk of fire across the landscape for the different forest cores. So fire is a little bit more widespread, but it tends to be moderate to low in terms of risk. Next slide, please. Pest, disease, and invasives. So these are the different data sets that we used to analyze the risk for these. We lump these together because they, the factors that contribute to the proliferation of pests or invasive species tend to be very similar. So edge to area ratio, so how much edge habitat is present. So that edge habitat stresses out the trees. They're more exposed to wind and salt and heat and drought, and then they're also able to provide more access to light so that invasive species could potentially get in there. Next slide. And kind of the inverse of that is depth to core interior. So deeper cores, less likely for those invasive species or those pests to penetrate further into those forests, causing more harm or damage. Next slide. We also use the distance to major roads again in this analysis for pest disease and invasives, because we know that major roads can be vectors or pathways for pests and invasives to be spread through firewood, for example, with like emerald ash borer, or seeds falling off of hay trucks or off of the dirt from vehicles. Next slide. Not going to show the storm surge again, but as Karen mentioned, the flooding and the salt spray can stress the forest. And so we pulled that data layer into pests and diseases as we did the analysis for those risks. And then the final one is disturbance, which comes from the Hansen change detection data. And that looked at what was the forest cover changes over time from 2001 to 2018. And so next slide, all of this pulled together showed that these were the areas where the forests were most at risk from pest diseases and invasive species. So a lot of stuff along the coast, a lot of stuff along the edges of some of the forest cores and some of the woodlands, and some of the more fragmented forest patches were at the highest risks. Next slide, please. And then isolation gets at how far are forest cores from one another. So the further away they are, the harder it is for species to be able to access an adjacent forest core for new habitat or for other resources like shelter or reproductive means. Forest cores can be isolated by major rivers or highways or other obstacles that would impede wildlife from moving from one forest core to another. Next slide, please. And then again, finally, we looked at, pulled in that disturbance layer again as just an overall risk, because the forest landscape is changing, whether it's through development or permanent land conversion, or whether it's through normal silvicultural cycles of timber harvest regime. So forest is cleared for timber and then replanted, but it's going to take a while for that replanted forest to grow back into a full canopy. So kind of looking at the permanence of the forest cover on the landscape. Next slide, please. So then we summed up all of the threats for all the forests. And here you can see the final product when we look at all of the different threats across the landscape and use different weights. So for example, sea level rise and development got greater weights because they resulted in more permanent conversions than things like fire or pest and invasive species, which can cause problems and alter the structure and function of a forest, but may not necessarily do that permanently. Or ways that we could devise management solutions to get around some of those risks. Next slide, please. So now that we know where the risks are for the different forests and forest fragments, we've had conversations already with our state advisory and local advisory committees on what are the management priorities. We also did several public engagements last December with the communities in the area. And these were some of the priorities, management priorities that they were concerned about and some of the values that they shared. So for example, access to parks was big, as well as revitalizing downtown districts. Water quality in terms of stream areas and groundwater recharge were also some of the things that we heard about. So we'll be using some of these values as we develop the management priorities with our groups. Next slide, please. So this is an opportunity for you all to help inform the work. So in the chat box, Carmera has shared some Jamboard links for each of the different landscape contexts, urban, suburban, and rural. And what we would like for you to do is to be able to inform us on some management strategies that you think would be appropriate to help make coastal forests more resilient within these landscape contexts. Next slide, please. So if you follow the links, you'll be taken to a Jamboard, which is basically a Google document where you can post sticky notes with text on different management strategies. So if you click on the little icon on the left-hand side, you can add a little sticky note and type some text in there. I've given a couple of examples already for this one, which is rural setting. So for example, expand forested stream buffers by planting more native trees. So we'll leave these open for the rest of the day, and we'll be able to collect this information. And this will help us when we go into our next steps, which are working with the local advisory committees and state advisory committees on management strategies. We'll have additional information from you all, which are providing a lot of expertise and local knowledge for the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide, please. So again, just the questions again, what types of threats to forest are most prevalent in your environment and how are they unique? And what management strategies would you apply for forest resiliency in those different landscape settings? Next slide. And so the next steps for this project, well, we've had a little setback with COVID, but we are going to convene with the State Advisory Committee to review the threats analysis that we've shared with you all here today. We're also going to share this with our local advisory committee and incorporate both of their feedbacks. And then we're going to start prioritizing forest cores and woodlands and start co-developing those management strategies based on those threats and priorities. And then share this information with the public and solicit their feedback. And then ultimately document the model process and share with other coastal states. Next slide. And with that, there's not really much any time left, but we're happy to take any comments with any remaining time that we have from the chat. You can also reach out to us using our email addresses there to be able to reach out with any questions that you have that were addressed in this session.
Thank you, Matt. And I also responded to several chat questions while you were talking, especially regarding sea level rise. And so those answers are in the chat if anyone wants to check those out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for doing that and answering those questions. I'm sorry we're at the end of our time for this session, but let's give a virtual hand to our speakers. Guys, thank you so much. That was really informative, and I'm looking forward to looking at some of the Jamboard answers myself.
Yes, we love all the input. Thank you.
Yeah, so please continue to add to those. I put the links in the chat. Click on them before the Zoom exit so you can have those links and you can add to the Jamboards. And don't forget to please provide feedback on this session. You can go to the session page on SCED and provide your comments. Share your experience and outdoor surroundings with us on social media. I know it's a rainy day here in Maryland, but if you go outside for a break or something, please take a picture and hashtag Chess Forum and hashtag Chess Collective and post a photo. If you enter some of the photos, someone can win a signed copy of Elizabeth Rush's book, Rising. Check out more of the sessions on SCED, and our next session will start at 11:45. Thank you again to Matt and Karen for a wonderful presentation, and we look forward to seeing you guys later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.